At this point, I've written around 4 videos, and I'm dissatisfied with all of them. There's something missing in each one, some spice, some of Dev's special sauce. I've even recorded a couple of them, and I'm gonna have to go back and re-record some parts or add some new information, because I'm just not satisfied with them. And I've finally figured out why. Before I go any further on this channel, we need to discuss an idea called concept creep, because it will be useful to describe what comes next. Concept creep is a relatively new term, coming out of Nick Haslam's 2016 psychology paper, Concept Creep, Psychology's Expanding Concepts of Harm and Pathology. Many of psychology's concepts have undergone semantic shifts in recent years. These conceptual changes follow a consistent trend. Concepts that refer to the negative aspects of human experience and behavior have expanded their meanings so much that they now encompass a much broader range of phenomena than before. This expansion takes horizontal and vertical forms. Concepts extend outward to capture qualitatively new phenomena, and downward to capture quantitatively less extreme phenomena. The concepts of abuse, bullying, trauma, mental disorder, addiction, and prejudice are examined to illustrate these historical changes. In each case, the concept's boundary has stretched and its meaning has dilated. A variety of explanations for concept creep are considered and its implications are explored. I contend that the expansion primarily reflects an ever-increasing sensitivity to harm, reflecting a liberal moral agenda. Its implications are ambivalent, however. Although conceptual change is inevitable and often well-motivated, concept creep runs the risk of pathologizing everyday experience and encouraging a sense of virtuous but impotent victimhood. In other words, the definitions of various words are being expanded to include more and more stuff that was not previously included but was on the edge. An example Haslam gives in the paper is the word bullying. In the 1970s, the term bullying was coined to describe aggressive behavior among children that was intentional, repeated, and perpetrated downward in a power hierarchy. However, over time, the definition of bullying expanded horizontally to include similar behaviors in different circumstances, like adults in workplaces, online instead of offline, or shunning or intimidating behavior rather than direct aggression. The definition also expanded vertically to include less extreme behavior committed within a similar dynamic, such as acts that were unintentional, unrepeated, and directed at people of equal or higher power within the hierarchy. Sometimes, concept creep is simply a product of greater understanding. It seems reasonable, for example, to describe bullying-like behavior between adults within a workplace hierarchy as a form of bullying, even if the term was created specifically to describe children. In fact, workplaces can be quite childish sometimes. But other times, concept creep can be extremely destructive. If a person does a behavior to you that, under normal circumstances, would be bullying, but he claims it was an accident, he apologizes, and he doesn't do it again, were you actually bullied? By some people's definitions, the answer is yes because of concept creep, but that makes the term bullying useless. In other words, sometimes the boundaries of a concept expand because the concept is relatively new and we recognize something outside the boundary that any reasonable person can see should be included. And other times the boundaries of a concept expand because it serves somebody's interest, and the integrity of the concept itself becomes a secondary concern. Since Haslam's 2016 definition of concept creep, psychological research on the topic has grown steadily, by Haslam and others working alongside him. In 2020, Haslam and Melanie J. McGrath penned an article on concept creep's effect on the word trauma, noticing that in 1884, a German doctor, Georg Edward von Rindfleisch, I can't pronounce these names, described trauma as any external attack which forcibly alters the physical or chemical composition of a part or a whole of the body, while nowadays trauma can refer to not only physical injury or illness, but infidelity, both complicated and uncomplicated childbirth, graduate school, violence within the media, and overheard sexist jokes by a few strangers that you walk by on the street. In 2021, Haslam, along with Ekaterina Volyumova, Michael Ziffer, and Yoshihisa Kashima, published The Cultural Dynamics of Concept Creep, which describes concept creep in not only a psychological context, but in cultural and social contexts. The article posits that attention paid to concepts involving harm has increased in Western society, leading to both an expansion of the concept of harm as well as a greater sensitivity to it. The article also touches on how this social and cultural shift is related to the expansion of left-wing politics across the same time period, though it doesn't go into detail, leaving it for a future paper. Ironically enough, the phrase concept creep has undergone its own form of concept creep, leaving the psychological space and moving into the wider lexicon, adopting new meanings as it goes. Here's what I mean. The term codependency was coined initially to describe people who were emotionally entangled with drug users, and therefore were co-addicted and codependent on the drug, not because they used the drug, but because they needed to manage the behaviors of a person who did. But nowadays, codependent is used to describe an entire array of behaviors that have nothing to do with the original concept, and in fact, depending on the circumstance, might not even be pathological, like having some personal boundaries that are non-standard, or being a people pleaser, or simply being dependent on those that you trust. The term narcissism is a specific personality disorder, but it's become common to simply label any jerk-like behavior as narcissism, even if the person is much more likely to be antisocial, or borderline, or histrionic, or just a jerk. Not all negative behavior is bad enough to be considered disordered. The term gaslighting came from the 1938 play Gaslight, where a man tries to make his wife and others think she's insane by physically moving things around in their apartment just slightly, and then telling her that she's wrong and possibly going nuts when she notices. Part of this process involves literally dimming the gas-fed lamps and then telling her that nothing's changed. It's always been that way. The double meaning of the play's title, referring to both the actual gas lights, as well as the idea of a woman going crazy due to her partner's influence, and how that metaphorically maps onto a small flame exploding if you add gas, caused the phrase gaslighting to take on a psychological meaning long after the play ran its course. And fair enough, it's a pretty useful term. But in 2022, gaslighting seems to be used to describe any form of invalidation for another person. I've heard people say, if you're in a fight with your partner and the two of you are disagreeing over the facts of an ambiguous situation, that your partner's gaslighting you. And that's just absurd. One of the most famous concept creeps is the term emotional labor, which was most prominent online about 5 years ago, floating around feminist spaces. Arlie Hochschild coined the term in the 1983 book, The Managed Heart. She used it to describe the labor of managing one's own emotions that was required by certain professions. Obvious examples are having to smile and be polite in the face of a rude customer in a service job, or in a stressful situation as a flight attendant, or having to maintain a professional demeanor while dealing with heinous crimes and their perpetrators when you're a cop or a lawyer or a judge. Or even having to act a bit harsher than you'd normally like to, if you're a coach, or a trainer, or a bill collector. But the definition of emotional labor has expanded to include the labor women do when they care. Caring about the men in their lives, the husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, and how those men expect to be comforted sometimes, takes up time and energy from women. Often, feminists who rely on this definition point out how this emotional labor is invisible, unpaid, and rarely recognized. This expanded definition links in very well with other feminist talking points at the time, about how women who stay at home don't get paid for the service of maintaining the house and raising the children. And in 2022, emotional labor has expanded again from that other definition to include just regular household stuff. If a woman does the dishes and a man's dirty dishes are also in the sink with hers, it's emotional labor. If a woman does the laundry and a man's laundry is also in the hamper with hers, it's emotional labor. At that point, it's just labor. It's just the job. But in talking about emotional labor, we're now on the fence between the psychological and the social, aren't we? And like I said earlier, concept creep can accurately be applied to many non-psychological domains. At this point, if you're as plugged in as me, your spidey senses are probably tingling, aren't they? You know what I'm about to say. Consider how the progs use the following words in current year: racism, misogyny, bigotry, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, trans rights, Nazi, fascist, toxic, incel, rapist. Some words that I'm sure you thought of that I didn't include, like diversity or inclusion, actually underwent a different process than concept creep. They had complete changes in definition, rather than an expansion of their boundaries. But the others, oh boy. Remember in like 2012 to 2016, the massive expansion of the word racist? How things that were clearly not racist, just normal everyday stuff, became racist? And then, after the word racist got thrown around enough, eventually everybody got desensitized to it. Nobody cared if they were called racist anymore, because that was just as likely to impart information about your accuser than it was to impart information about you. Well, at that point, the prog shifted to fascist. Remember how, from like 2018 onward, there was a massive expansion of the word fascist? How things that were clearly not fascist, just normal everyday stuff, became fascist? I wonder what's gonna happen when people stop caring that they're being called fascists. Here's the problem with concept creep in this sociological sense. Let's use the concept of racism as an example. Dressing up in a white hood and burning a cross in the front lawn of a black man and then jumping him and hanging him off a tree when he comes out to see what's going on, that's pretty clearly a racist act. But disliking a black woman's kinky hair by the 2022 standard is also a racist act. So clearly there's a spectrum between the two because these are not the same thing, and calling them both racist makes the word significantly less useful nowadays due to the huge difference between the two ends of the spectrum. Nowadays, if somebody were to tell me, hey, that guy over there is a racist, I don't know if he just wants black people to straighten their hair before coming into work, or if he literally boot fucks them in the street. The term rape has undergone a similar transition. Rape expanded to include non-penetrative sexual assault, then to include over-the-clothes molestation, then to include consensual sex that the person wasn't happy with the next morning, then to include behavior that isn't even sexual but is perceived as rapey. Probably the most mimetic and early example of this process was the phrase stare rape. Yeah, this image is from like 2011, but it eventually became a real thing. Within the political realm, concept creep is heavily linked to the Mott and Bailey debate tactic, where a person conflates two similar positions, the first being modest and easy to defend, the second being significantly more controversial. They advance the controversial position, but when they're attacked, they claim as defense the more modest position. Which is why a BLM activist might demand the same level of moral righteousness be directed towards a stuffy boss who dislikes kinky hair as towards a slave owner or a hooded KKK member. Or a feminist activist may demand the same consideration as the victim of a violent rape that left them disfigured for her experience where a dude awkwardly hit on her, she shot him down, and he left her alone. I mentioned earlier that Haslam saw a correlation between concept creep in the social sense and left-leaning politics, and that was going to be a topic that he hoped to research in the future. Since that paper hasn't been published yet, I mean, who's to say? But intuitionally, I'm just sitting here thinking, like, yes, obviously. Robert Conquest was a British historian who, despite his published books, is most well remembered for his 3 laws of politics. He never actually wrote these laws down in any of his books, but he spoke about them extensively. The 3 laws are: 1. Everyone is conservative about what he knows best. 2. Any organization not explicitly right-wing sooner or later becomes left-wing. 3. The simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it's being controlled by a cabal of its enemies. The most rock-solid of these 3 laws seems to be the first one, and that is the one relevant to today's conversation. It seems to me that part of the experience of being young is rapidly and easily creating correlations and associations within your head. Everything is new to you. You're learning about the basics of the world. The connections that you form while you're a child are deep and lasting. It's not just what pain feels like and what causes it. What's the difference between a cut, a burn, a sting, and a bruise? It's not just what colors look like, or what happens when you drop a ball out a window, or why birds can fly but people can't. It's also stuff like your home is a safe, familiar place, or maybe it's not, or what your favorite foods are, or maybe what you hate. How much you like your family, your friends, your teacher, your school, or how much you don't like them. It's also stuff like the feel of the surface of your kitchen countertop, or the sound in your ears as you lie in a bathtub filling with warm water. In your formative years, you learn about the rules of reality while, at the same time, imbuing your perception of that reality with meaning that is specific to you. Hence that famous line, "There are many like it, but this one is mine." We have grown to think of that quotation as being a little bit sinister, but it doesn't have to be. It's simply describing an emotional attachment to a specific thing. And it doesn't only apply to guns. Everybody might have had a Nintendo 64 growing up, but my childhood N64 is mine, and from my point of view, it's got an irreplaceable quality. But as you get older, this process slows down quite a bit. Psychologically speaking, this is called crystallization, where all of the knowledge you've gained begins to crystallize into place, and becomes the foundation upon which you build your adult life. But it's not always the case that you've simply learned a bunch of stuff that's become crystallized, and your learning circuits have shut off, and that's who you are, and that's that. That can happen, sure. But it seems to me that for a mature, well-rounded individual, they haven't actually stopped learning, they're just relying on a level of mastery that they have. Consider a child first learning to use a ruler, and compare him with a carpenter who's been measuring for 30 years of his adult life. The child may make all sort of moves that the adult will consider to be mistakes. He may ask, why does 1 foot have to be this long? Why can't it be longer or shorter? He may not fully grasp how to do the math, or even what math is. This doesn't make him dumb. And the fact that the adult doesn't ask these questions doesn't mean that he's unable to learn new things. Conquest's first law, everyone is conservative about what he knows best, is a law about mastery. What distinguishes a novice from a master? What does it mean to know a thing? And what does it mean to learn? And it's not about close-mindedness, even though that is, from the leftist perspective, a necessary conservative trait. And that is how a leftist would read this quotation. It's more like, if you know something, you've already experimented with it. You've already experienced what constitutes success and failure. You don't need to be more open because you've already honed in on the truth. That is what the conservative virtue is in this conversation, having a very tight focus. So let's bring this back to the concept creep conversation. Consider the bread tuber who calls everything and everyone a fascist. To him, everyone on the right is a fascist, and everyone not him is on the right. The various distinctions and differences don't really matter. Conservatives are fascists because they voted for Trump. Soccer moms are fascists because they like the local cops who come into their diner that she works at. Video games are fascists because they promote competition and edgy behavior online. Soc Dems are fascists too, because they seek to relieve the working class's material conditions while preventing a socialist revolution. Look at how the definition of fascism, in their minds, has concept creeped its way to encompassing a huge swath of people, to the point that the term is meaningless. Meanwhile, the same bread tuber will be very strict about which flavor of leftism that he is, and what tiny granular distinction makes him radically different from other types of leftist. To him, there is a hard boundary between a Marxist-Leninist, a Stalinist, a Maoist, a libertarian socialist, an anarcho-syndicalist, a Christian socialist. I mean, look at all this shit. The description of leftism itself reads like a leftist meme. Remember Conquest's first law. Everyone is conservative about what he knows best. Most bread tubers don't know about the true nature of right-wing politics. They simply see them all as the other. The same way that a great empire does not distinguish between the many different tribes beyond the border. They're all simply barbarians. And you know what? It's pretty easy and convenient to do that. This way, you don't have to become knowledgeable about who you oppose. You can simply treat them all the same. Who cares about the borders that divide them if they're basically the same thing anyway? They're not you, and that's what's important. But the bread trooper does know about their own politics very deeply, and so the borders for those concepts are rock solid. And yes, the right wing does this too. I've heard many right-leaning people say that neoconservatives and paleoconservatives are radically different, and also that libertarians are not the same thing, and paleo-libertarians too, and monarchists and reactionaries are also at odds with the more Republican-minded rightists, and also that who cares, everyone on the left is a commie, from the milquetoast neolib establishment to the actual communists. People are actually more conservative with what they know, because their deep knowledge allows them to see the topic more clearly. The borders are more defined, the concepts are more explored, but a lack of knowledge leads to fuzzy borders and the assumption that the topics that you have yet to explore are actually just as shallow as they appear. If I had to guess, this is why concept creep is oozing out of leftist spaces right now, because of an actual lack of deep knowledge of the things they're opposing, combined with the fact that a leftist point of view does not easily lend itself to drawing harder borders. It's also a reason why people tend to become more conservative as they age, which was a topic of a previous video that I made, because as people become more knowledgeable, the borders between concepts become clearer. At the same time, tremendous political power has been seized by simply calling people a racist or a sexist or a fascist or a rapist, because it's very easy to demand the absolute worst reaction from others once you slap one of these labels on a person, even if what they actually did isn't deserving of that absolute worst reaction, because the concept has expanded. And I think that's why the right has finally adopted the same tactics. The phrase critical race theory has been tainted in this way, moving beyond the poisonous doctrine of the original thing, and is now actually being used to refer to even just teaching about the history of slavery in an appropriate way. And yes, that's actually happening. There are also rightoids online saying that now that the pendulum's swinging once again, they need to stop pretending that pornography counts as free speech and move to ban it. And yes, McCarthy's wide anti-communist net catching legitimate non-communist also counts. The most relevant example right now is the current groomer discourse, where the right has finally found a label with both the sticking power and the inaccuracy of racist and fascist. Yes, there are a lot of bad actors out there, a lot of real groomers. That video is coming very soon. But, for example, the teacher who is gay, who takes a few days off class to get married, and then when asked about his wife by a student, casually says that it's his husband actually, that person isn't a groomer, and yet the outrage machine never ever sleeps. We are moving into what I think is going to be a pretty dark time, epistemologically speaking. The left has been concept creeping its way across the intellectual landscape for over a decade now, and the right has basically just been holding their dicks, impotently saying, hey, what happened to tolerance? Or what about the liberal idea of neutrality and openness? And the right moves slow, but they do eventually move, and they've finally figured out that they're dealing with leftists, not liberals, that the name of the game is concept creep for political benefit. So now they're playing that game, and look at the leftoids screech. The sheer, unadulterated derangement of the groomer discourse is hard to overstate. Shut the fuck up. You retards have been baselessly calling everyone racists and Nazis since I was in high school. I don't like this. I don't support it, but I understand it. This is the world you built. You started this. You wanted this. You were the ones who said that civility in politics was toxic. You were the ones who said that the liberal idea of neutrality rested upon and implicitly held up the white supremacist capitalist patriarchal structures. You were the ones who infiltrated neutral institutions, changed definitions of words, pushed politics into every corner of life, and violated every compromise with the right that your predecessors struck. The only reason that you expect the right to keep playing by the same set of liberal rules that you yourself violate is because it would be good for you. And the only reason that you're complaining that the right is doing what you've done for years now is because it's going to be bad for you. I don't like what's happening. It's going to be terrible for us as a culture and a civilization. But this is the bed that the left has made for itself. Anyway, that's what concept creep is. A psychological topic that's made its way into politics, and it accurately describes the slow but steady corruption of various ideas into forms that explicitly benefit progressive politics. I was writing my Don't Say Gay video when I realized that over half of the video was stuck describing what concept creep was. And then I also realized all of my other upcoming videos relied on an understanding of the topic, so I just cut the script off into its own thing. I hope you enjoyed it, and please keep in mind what I said here as we start exploring some of the other topics in the future. I will see you next time, guys. I love you.